Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our new writing unit, Fantasy Writing. In this unit, you will be writing your own fantasy story, and I hope that you've finished our fantasy reading unit with lots of ideas about how you can write your own stories and things you want to include and things you want to do as writers. So our goal today and tomorrow will be to generate ideas for our own stories. Now in today's class, I'll go through some ways you can do that, and then in the second half of class, we're going to look at some student exemplars from last year so you have a good idea about what your story might look like. And what I hope is that you see how a story can be told in a few pages, not 10, 12, or 15. So in this unit, our goal is to write a short story, not a chapter and not a book. All right, so the goal I have up here for you today is to use what is real as a way to generate ideas about what is not real. So what I hope to show you today is that a lot of fantasy stories are grounded or rooted in the real world. Okay, and to help you kind of visualize that, I have this. I've drawn a tree. Okay, it's not the greatest tree in the world, but what I want you to see is that I want you to see the roots here. Okay, and then I got this line across the middle, and below it is reality, so this is the real world, and above it is the fantasy world that our story might take place in. So what I have here, zoom. Okay, so let's look at this one example here. Right, it says, sick parent at home. So this is something that happens in the real world, unfortunately. And as a writer, you might have this experience of having a sick parent at home, and that might be the inspiration for a story where a noble hero has to go on a quest to find a magic potion and save the queen. Okay, so there is something happening in reality, and it may become this fantasy story. In reality, you may have an experience where you and a friend are mad at each other, or you and a sibling, you and someone else. That might turn into two kingdoms at war, or like wizards or witches or monsters that are in this epic fight, and the weight of the world is on or rests on the result of this battle. Okay. Another example, and we talked about this a lot in the last unit, is how our fears, okay, ordinary fears in our life or dangers in our life become dragons. Okay, so that's another example of how something from the real world can become fantastical or magical or unreal. Okay, so what we're trying to do here is take what's real and use it as a way to generate ideas about what's not real, okay, our fantasy world. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to write something about the real world, an experience that you may have had. And then you're going to stop and you're going to try to come up with an idea for a fantasy story based on what I write. So I'm going to put it right here. And I'm going to write injury. Okay, so this could be broken leg, broken foot, broken arm, any kind of injury. Okay, so maybe you've had that experience, maybe not, where you've had to sit at home, or you can't do things the same as everyone else because you have this injury. So I want you to think for a moment, what might this turn into if it were a fantasy story? Okay, how might the experiences you have when you're injured and kind of on the sidelines and you can't do all the things you want, what kind of fantasy story might that turn into? Okay, so right now you're going to answer that question in Edpuzzle. Okay, so this is one way to generate ideas, to think about conflicts we have in the real world. Okay, another method of generating ideas is related to the setting. Okay, so one way to generate ideas or develop a story is to think deeply about the setting and what might happen there, what might be there, and what it might look like. So I have 3 examples for you, and these are common examples. And what I'm doing, I'm following my tree picture here with the roots as reality. Okay, we may have our stories take place in our world, in the real world. So the one that jumps out to me is one I'm reading right now to my daughter, Charlotte's Web. This takes place. Takes place on a farm. Okay, the animals and insects happen to talk, which makes it a fantasy, but the rest of the world is real. Okay, so your fantasy story could happen in the real world. An example might be this right here. John is staring at the whiteboard, and an elf crawls out of his pencil case. And there's our elf coming out of the pencil case. There he is. So, an example of this could be the third wish, right? So Mr. Peters is a normal person. There's nothing magical or fantastical about him, but he stumbles upon this unreal thing that's happening in his world, okay, with the swan in the forest. Okay, so that's one possible setting. Okay, one kind of setting archetype. Another one is one that includes both worlds. Okay, and we see this often. We've seen it in our unit. And it involves a portal that connects the 2 worlds. We see this in Harry Potter. We see this in The Thief of Always. In The Thief of Always, it's the mist, the wall of mist that surrounds the holiday house. In Harry Potter, it's Hogwarts, and he crosses a threshold to get to that world. My example here is John steps into his locker and enters another world. He can only be rescued by someone who can show how author's craft connects a theme. Right? Not the greatest story, I'm sure, but what's clear is that there are 2 worlds, and John moves from the real world to the fantasy world through his locker. Okay. A third option is the entire story takes place in a fantasy world, and the example here is Lord of the Rings, right? So the Shire is not a real place. Hobbits are not real. The entire story takes place in a fantasy world. And here I've got John lives in a castle in the clouds and rides the Rattling Rhino to school. Okay, so this entire story takes place in the fantasy world. Okay, so what we did was we looked at 2 ways to generate and develop ideas. Okay, one is to look at conflicts of our real world and use them to generate ideas about the fantasy world and what might happen there. The second method is to think about the setting. And there are 3 possibilities that I just shared with you. These are not the only 3. Okay, but there's the fantasy world. There's a story that has 2 worlds, or 3 or 4, and a portal. And then there is the most interesting, the world we live in, right? So our real world. Now, you might be asking yourself, have we learned this before? Right? Have we done this before? The answer is yes. Okay, during our personal narrative unit, you guys went through many days of generating ideas. We talked about the first time you did something, the last time you did something, like the first time I went skiing, the last time I was in Seoul, okay, or a time you learned something. And the time I learned when my dad really understood me. That was my example from the unit. Or people you care about. So you think about someone and you identify specific moments where something special happened. Okay, so we've done that work before. Today we're kind of adding these other two methods to help us jump into a fantasy world. So your work today is to generate ideas. Okay, you're going to spend about 20 minutes working in your notebooks, generating as many ideas as you can about your fantasy story. So we're going to think about real life conflict. You're going to think about settings. Okay, and whatever works for you in your notebook. You might make a list. You might draw something. You might make a chart, a mind map. It's really up to you. And my suggestion, and you don't have to do this, but the real world conflict we're all dealing with right now is COVID-19. So you may want to look into your COVID journal for something that you wrote that would be worthy of exploring more as a fantasy story. So that would be an example of using a real life conflict to generate ideas for a fantasy story. So at the end of the class today, you're going to share and you're going to submit your notebook work. So I expect to see at least a whole page of ideas about what your story might be. And I'm real excited to see them. So please work hard today, and I'll see you during a conference. Bye-bye.